At some point, in every life, you meet someone who simply refuses to play fair. They twist your words in front of others. They shift the goalposts the moment you meet their last demand. They deny things they said only minutes earlier, with a straight face, watching to see if you will lose your composure trying to prove it. It is a genuinely disorienting experience the first few times it happens to you, and it tends to leave a lasting mark on how much you trust your own perception of a given situation afterward. Most people respond to this kind of opponent with more honesty, more patience, more good faith, assuming, reasonably enough, that decency will eventually win out if they simply keep behaving well. Machiavelli, watching the brutal political games of Renaissance Italy unfold around him, arrived at a considerably darker and considerably more useful conclusion. Fighting a dirty player with pure honesty is not nobility. It is often a slow, one-sided surrender because you are following one set of rules while they follow none at all. A mismatch that rarely resolves itself simply through the passage of time or the strength of your own good intentions. This does not mean you need to become dishonest, cruel, or dirty yourself in order to win. It means you need to become considerably smarter than the person trying to manipulate you, using psychological tools sharp enough to outmaneuver a bad faith opponent without ever lowering yourself to their level and without ever losing sight of the honest, decent character you actually want to keep at the end of the conflict, regardless of how it ultimately resolves. Tonight, on The Hidden Mind, we are breaking down 10 Machiavellian psychology tricks built for exactly this situation. The moment someone decides to play dirty with you, and you decide, calmly and deliberately, to outsmart them instead of simply outlasting them. A decision that changes everything about how the rest of that conflict actually unfolds. Let's begin, and let's finally give you the tools this situation always deserved. Welcome to The Hidden Mind, the channel dedicated to uncovering the real mechanics of power, psychology, and influence hiding beneath the surface of everyday life. The patterns that determine, far more often than most people realize, who gets quietly outmaneuvered and who walks away with their integrity and their genuine interests both fully intact. If you are new here, you should know this is not a channel built around comfortable, feel-good platitudes. It is a channel built around the uncomfortable, unfiltered truths that protect you the moment you actually need them, not simply when it is convenient to discuss them. Today's video addresses one of the most requested topics in this community: exactly what to do when someone in your life, a coworker, a family member, a business rival, a former friend, decides to abandon fair play entirely and start manipulating, deceiving, or undermining you deliberately, often while presenting themselves publicly as the more reasonable, more wronged party in the situation. We are going to walk through 10 distinct psychology tricks drawn from Machiavelli's cold, unsentimental understanding of human nature. Tricks designed specifically to help you outsmart a dishonest opponent mentally, without requiring you to sink to their level or abandon your own integrity in the process. This is not comfortable material, and some of what we discuss today will challenge the instinct to simply keep being patient and hope the other person eventually comes around on their own. But patience alone rarely stops someone who has already decided honesty is optional, and this channel exists to give you considerably sharper tools than patience alone. Before we begin, I want to ask you for a few small things that genuinely matter to this channel and the growing community around it. If today's video gives you even one moment of real clarity, please take a couple of seconds to hit the like button. It is the simplest, most direct way to help this video reach the people who need it. Leave a comment below and tell us honestly whether you are currently dealing with someone who plays dirty in your own life. We read every single comment, and they genuinely shape what we build here next. If you know someone currently being outmaneuvered by a manipulative coworker, a dishonest business partner, or a manipulative family member, share this video with them. It might be exactly the toolkit they have been needing. And if you have not yet subscribed to The Hidden Mind, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications right now, because we release a brand new deep dive into power, psychology, and human nature every single week. Finally, if this channel provides real value to you, please consider supporting our work directly with a super thanks using the button below. Every single contribution genuinely helps us continue building this project. Now, let's break down exactly how to outsmart someone who refuses to play fair. Why honesty alone loses against dishonesty. Before we walk through the 10 tricks themselves, it is worth understanding exactly why simply remaining honest, patient, and good faith is so often insufficient against someone who has already decided to abandon those same principles. This is not a small or trivial question, and taking the time to genuinely understand the underlying mechanics here will make every single trick discussed afterward considerably easier to apply with real confidence, rather than simply memorized as an isolated list of tactics without any deeper understanding of why they actually work the way they do. Machiavelli observed this dynamic repeatedly among the courts and conflicts he studied closely, noting that a leader who insisted on following every rule of fair conduct while facing a rival willing to lie, deceive, and manipulate freely was, in effect, fighting with one hand deliberately tied behind their back. The honest party telegraphs their intentions clearly, keeps their word predictably, and generally operates within a framework the dishonest party has already discarded entirely, which means the dishonest party can study the honest party's predictable behavior and plan around it with considerable precision, while the honest party remains genuinely uncertain what the dishonest party will actually do next. This imbalance is not simply unfair, it is structurally, mathematically disadvantageous, and pretending otherwise, hoping that simply continuing to behave well will eventually shame the dishonest party into reciprocating, frequently produces nothing except continued exploitation. Machiavelli's insight here was never that you should become dishonest yourself, adopting the same manipulative tactics as your opponent, but rather that you needed to become considerably more strategically aware, considerably harder to read, and considerably more willing to use legitimate psychological tools, timing, patience, documentation, calm questioning, strategic silence, to counter an opponent who has already abandoned fair play, without ever abandoning your own genuine integrity in the process. This distinction matters enormously throughout everything we discuss today. Outsmarting a dirty player mentally is not the same as becoming a dirty player yourself. It is the discipline of remaining honest while becoming considerably too sharp, too composed, and too strategically aware to be easily manipulated by someone who is not. With that foundation established, let's move through the 10 tricks. Trick 1. Name the game silently. The first trick concerns the single most important shift you can make the moment you realize you are dealing with someone who plays dirty. Silently, internally naming exactly what tactic they are using, without announcing that recognition out loud. Machiavelli understood that manipulation tactics, while endlessly varied in their surface presentation, tend to fall into a fairly limited set of recognizable patterns, denying something they clearly said, shifting blame the moment they are confronted, moving the goalposts once you have met their previous demand, or manufacturing a crisis specifically to distract from a point you were making that they could not actually answer. The moment you can silently, privately identify which specific pattern is currently being deployed against you, that pattern loses an enormous portion of its power over you, because manipulation depends heavily on the target reacting instinctively and emotionally, without recognizing the tactic clearly enough to respond to it strategically instead. Consider a coworker who, when confronted about missing a deadline that was clearly their responsibility, immediately pivots to criticizing your own performance on an unrelated project from months earlier. The untrained target feels the conversation's focus shift and instinctively begins defending the unrelated criticism, entirely losing track of the original, legitimate issue that was actually being discussed. The trained target, silently recognizing this as a classic deflection tactic, simply notes internally, "This is deflection," and calmly redirects the conversation back to the original point, without taking the emotional bait even slightly. This trick requires no confrontation, no accusation, and no visible change in your outward behavior. It is purely an internal shift in awareness, and that internal shift alone frequently proves powerful enough to prevent a manipulation tactic from working at all, simply because you have stopped reacting to it as though it were a genuine, spontaneous development rather than a recognizable, repeatable pattern. Trick 2. Let them underestimate you. The second trick concerns the genuine strategic value of allowing a dishonest opponent to believe you are less perceptive, less prepared, and less strategically aware than you actually are. Machiavelli observed that leaders who were clearly recognized as sharp, formidable strategists invited considerably more caution and careful planning from their rivals, while leaders who were underestimated, dismissed as naive or unremarkable, frequently found their rivals overreaching, taking risks and making mistakes they never would have attempted against an opponent they took seriously from the very beginning. Applied to dealing with a dirty player, this trick asks you to resist the urge to immediately demonstrate how thoroughly you have seen through their tactics, and instead, to allow them to continue operating under the comfortable, mistaken assumption that their manipulation is working exactly as intended. Consider a business negotiation with a partner who has already shown a willingness to misrepresent numbers when it benefits them. The moment you loudly, visibly demonstrate that you have caught every previous instance of this behavior, you force them to become considerably more careful and considerably more sophisticated in their next attempt, making future deception harder for you to detect. But if you allow them to believe their previous deception went entirely unnoticed, continuing to appear cooperative and even slightly credulous, they frequently become bolder and sloppier in their next attempt, providing you with considerably clearer, more obvious evidence of the exact pattern you were already quietly documenting. This trick requires genuine emotional discipline, resisting the natural, satisfying urge to announce your own cleverness the moment you catch someone in a lie, in favor of the considerably more strategically valuable choice to let that lie continue playing out until you have gathered everything you actually need. Trick 3. Study their pattern, not their excuses. The third trick asks you to shift your attention deliberately away from the specific words a dishonest person offers in any given moment. Their explanations, their justifications, their promises to do better, and toward the considerably more reliable evidence of their actual, repeated behavior over time. Machiavelli observed that dishonest people are frequently remarkably skilled at constructing plausible, even genuinely convincing explanations for their behavior in the moment. Explanations specifically designed to diffuse your suspicion and buy themselves additional room to continue the same pattern, and that a person who focuses primarily on evaluating these explanations rather than on the underlying pattern those explanations keep being deployed to excuse remains perpetually vulnerable to being talked back into trust that the actual evidence does not support. Consider a friend who has now, on 3 separate occasions, borrowed money and failed to repay it as promised, each time offering a genuinely sympathetic, plausible explanation for the delay: a medical emergency, a sudden job loss, a family crisis. Evaluated individually, each explanation might seem entirely reasonable and worthy of continued trust. Evaluated as a pattern, 3 separate instances of the exact same outcome, regardless of how different and sympathetic each individual explanation happened to be, reveals something considerably more reliable about what will likely happen the 4th time money is requested. This trick asks you to deliberately keep a running, honest account of actual outcomes and actual patterns in your significant relationships, rather than resetting your evaluation back to 0 every time a new, sympathetic explanation arrives to excuse the latest instance of a familiar pattern repeating itself yet again. Trick 4. Deny them their audience. The 4th trick concerns a genuinely important insight about the specific mechanics of many manipulation tactics, that a considerable number of them depend heavily on the presence of an audience, other people watching, whose perception the manipulator is actively trying to shape in their own favor. Machiavelli observed that public accusation, public humiliation, and public displays of righteous indignation carried far more manipulative power when performed in front of witnesses than the exact same behavior would carry in a private, one-on-one setting, because the manipulator is frequently working to shape a broader social narrative rather than genuinely trying to resolve the underlying issue directly with you. Consider a colleague who repeatedly raises pointed, unfair criticisms of your work, specifically in group meetings, in front of shared colleagues and superiors, rather than raising these same concerns privately, where a genuine, good-faith resolution might actually be possible. The public setting itself is doing considerable work here, making it harder for you to respond calmly without appearing defensive in front of witnesses, and allowing the colleague to shape a narrative about your competence in front of an audience whose perception genuinely matters to your professional reputation. This trick asks you to develop the specific skill of calmly, without visible frustration, redirecting these public performances into private conversations, saying simply that you would be glad to discuss the specific concern in detail after the meeting, one-on-one, which frequently causes a manipulator working primarily for audience effect to lose considerable interest in pursuing the conversation at all, precisely because a private setting removes the actual mechanism their tactic depended upon in the first place. Trick 5. Document before you confront. The fifth trick concerns the genuine strategic value of quiet, careful documentation, gathered patiently over time, before ever attempting a direct confrontation with someone who has demonstrated a pattern of dishonest behavior. Machiavelli understood that premature confrontation, launched before you have gathered sufficient concrete evidence, frequently allows a skilled dishonest opponent to simply deny, deflect, or reframe the single incident you are raising, precisely because a single incident, however clear it feels to you personally, is often genuinely easier to dispute, minimize, or explain away than an accumulated pattern documented clearly across multiple specific instances. Consider a workplace situation involving a manager who has, on several occasions, taken credit for ideas and work that genuinely originated with you, each individual instance ambiguous enough on its own to be plausibly explained away as an honest misunderstanding or a simple oversight. Confronting the manager after the very first instance, with nothing beyond your own memory and frustration to support the claim, invites exactly the kind of denial and reframing that leaves you looking difficult or overly sensitive rather than genuinely wronged. Quietly documenting each specific instance as it occurs, dates, details, and any available supporting evidence like emails or messages, before eventually raising the pattern as a whole, considerably strengthens your position and makes denial or dismissal significantly more difficult for the other party to successfully pull off. This trick requires genuine patience and a willingness to delay the satisfaction of immediate confrontation in favor of the considerably more effective strategy of building an undeniable case before you actually need to present it. Trick 6. Ask the question that traps itself. The sixth trick concerns a genuinely elegant psychological technique, using calm, specific, carefully constructed questions rather than direct accusations to expose inconsistency in a dishonest person's account of events, allowing their own answers to reveal the contradiction rather than requiring you to make the accusation yourself. Machiavelli observed that direct accusation frequently triggers immediate defensiveness, causing the accused party to dig in and defend their position more rigidly than they might have if they had simply been allowed to answer a series of calm, specific questions that gradually, naturally exposed the inconsistency in their own account on their own. Consider a situation where someone has given you two different, contradictory explanations for the same event on two separate occasions. Rather than confronting them directly with, "You are lying to me," which invites immediate defensive denial, a more effective approach involves calmly asking a specific, neutral question that requires them to restate their account clearly. Something like, "Can you walk me through exactly what happened again, just so I have the full picture?" This calm, non-accusatory framing frequently causes the inconsistency to surface naturally in their own words, considerably harder for them to dismiss or explain away than an accusation you make on their behalf, precisely because the contradiction is now something they said themselves, in their own words, rather than something you claimed about them that they can simply deny. Trick 7. Refuse their frame. The seventh trick concerns a genuinely important psychological discipline, recognizing when a dishonest person is attempting to control the terms and framing of a conflict, and deliberately, calmly refusing to accept that framing rather than arguing within it. Machiavelli observed that skilled manipulators frequently work hard to establish the frame through which any given conflict gets discussed and understood, because whoever successfully establishes that frame frequently gains significant advantage in how the conflict ultimately gets resolved, regardless of the actual underlying facts. Consider a family conflict where one person has genuinely wronged another, and yet consistently frames every subsequent conversation around how sensitive and overly emotional the wronged party is being, rather than around the original, legitimate grievance itself. If the wronged party accepts this frame, even to argue against it, insisting repeatedly that they are not being overly sensitive, they have already lost considerable ground, because the entire conversation is now taking place on the manipulator's chosen terrain, their emotional sensitivity, rather than on the original terrain that actually matters, the specific behavior that caused genuine, legitimate harm in the first place. This trick asks you to notice, clearly and quickly, when a frame like this is being established, and to calmly, deliberately, redirect the conversation back to the original, substantive issue, refusing to engage with the manipulator's preferred framing, even when doing so requires repeating your redirection multiple times before it finally lands. Trick 8. Make patience their enemy. The 8th trick concerns a genuinely powerful strategic insight about the specific psychology of most dishonest, manipulative people, that they frequently depend heavily on speed, urgency, and quick resolution to make their tactics work effectively, and that deliberately slowing everything down, refusing to be rushed into an immediate decision or reaction, frequently strips their manipulation of much of its actual power. Machiavelli observed that pressure tactics, manufactured urgency, and demands for immediate response were consistently favored tools of dishonest negotiators and manipulators precisely because these tactics prevent the target from thinking clearly, gathering additional information, or consulting with trusted advisors before being forced into a decision. Consider a salesperson or negotiator who insists that a particular offer or deal is only available right now, today, and will disappear entirely if you take even a single day to think it over carefully. This manufactured urgency is frequently a deliberate tactic designed specifically to prevent you from doing exactly the kind of careful, patient evaluation that would likely reveal the deal to be considerably less favorable than it initially appears under pressure. This trick asks you to develop the specific, deliberate habit of slowing down whenever you notice genuine pressure or urgency being applied to your decision-making, treating that pressure itself as meaningful information about the actual quality and legitimacy of whatever is being offered or demanded, rather than simply complying with the artificial timeline someone else has constructed specifically to prevent your careful, considered evaluation. Trick 9. Build your coalition before the fight starts. The 9th trick concerns the genuine strategic value of cultivating credibility, relationships, and allies well before you actually need them in a genuine conflict, rather than scrambling to build support only after a dishonest opponent has already begun actively working to undermine your reputation and credibility. Machiavelli observed repeatedly that leaders who had already built broad goodwill and credible relationships before a genuine political conflict arose held an enormous advantage over rivals attempting to build support reactively, in the middle of an active crisis, when their motives for suddenly seeking allies appeared considerably more transparent and self-serving. Consider a workplace situation where a colleague has begun quietly, subtly undermining your reputation with shared supervisors and peers. If you have spent the preceding months and years building genuine, credible relationships across your organization, based on consistent, demonstrated competence and integrity, that broader reputation provides a genuine, difficult-to-dismiss counterweight against the colleague's more recent, targeted undermining. If, however, you have kept largely to yourself, with few genuine relationships beyond your immediate role, you find yourself considerably more vulnerable to a dishonest colleague's narrative taking hold with less resistance, simply because there are fewer people with first-hand, credible experience of your actual character available to contradict it. This trick asks you to treat relationship building and credibility as an ongoing, proactive investment made consistently over time, rather than an emergency measure you scramble to construct only once a genuine conflict with a dishonest opponent has already begun. Trick 10. Know when to walk instead of win. The 10th and final trick concerns perhaps the most difficult psychological discipline of all, developing the genuine wisdom to recognize when a particular conflict with a dishonest opponent is not actually winnable in any meaningful sense, and when the wisest, most strategic choice is complete disengagement rather than continued attempts at victory. Machiavelli observed that some conflicts, once they had progressed to a certain point of entrenched dishonesty and bad faith on the other side, simply could not be won through continued engagement, no matter how skillfully that engagement was conducted, because the other party had already demonstrated a willingness to abandon any shared standard of fair resolution entirely, making genuine victory, in the sense of a fair, mutually acknowledged outcome, essentially impossible to achieve through continued direct conflict. Consider a business relationship or a friendship with someone who has repeatedly, demonstrably shown themselves willing to lie, manipulate, and act in bad faith, regardless of how much clear, documented evidence you accumulate or how skillfully you apply every other trick discussed throughout today's video. At a certain point, continued engagement with this specific person, hoping that the right strategy or the right piece of evidence will finally produce a fair, honest resolution, becomes its own form of loss, an ongoing investment of time, energy, and emotional resource into a conflict that was never actually structured to produce a fair outcome in the first place. This final trick asks you to develop genuine, honest judgment about when you have reached this point in a specific relationship or conflict, and the considerable courage required to simply walk away completely, redirecting the very real energy and resource you would otherwise continue spending on an unwinnable conflict toward relationships and pursuits that can actually reciprocate your good faith in return. Bringing the 10 tricks together. Having walked through all 10 of these psychology tricks individually, it is worth stepping back to see the coherent, unified philosophy that connects them into a single, practical approach for outsmarting a dishonest opponent without ever needing to become dishonest yourself. Silently naming the manipulation tactic as it occurs strips it of much of its power before you ever need to respond to it directly. Allowing yourself to be underestimated creates room for a dishonest opponent to overreach and reveal themselves more clearly than they would against someone they took seriously from the start. Focusing on demonstrated patterns rather than momentary explanations protects you from being repeatedly talked back into trust the actual evidence does not support. Denying a manipulator their audience removes much of the actual mechanism their public tactics depend upon. Documenting carefully before confronting directly builds a case considerably harder to deny or dismiss than a single, isolated accusation. Asking calm, specific questions, rather than direct accusations, allows contradiction to surface naturally in someone's own words. Refusing to accept a manipulator's preferred framing of a conflict keeps the actual, substantive issue at the center of the conversation, rather than allowing the conversation to drift onto terrain that favors the dishonest party. Slowing everything down whenever genuine urgency or pressure appears strips manufactured urgency of much of its manipulative power. Building genuine credibility and relationships proactively, before any conflict arises, provides a durable counterweight against a dishonest opponent's attempts to undermine your reputation reactively. And developing the wisdom and courage to walk away entirely from conflicts that have proven genuinely unwinnable protects your time, energy, and emotional resource from being endlessly consumed by a conflict that was never actually structured to produce a fair outcome. Together, these 10 tricks describe a genuinely powerful, genuinely ethical way of protecting yourself against dishonest, manipulative opponents. One that never requires you to abandon your own integrity, but that refuses to remain naively vulnerable simply because maintaining that naivety felt more comfortable than developing the sharper, more strategic awareness this video has spent its runtime describing. Why dishonest people are more predictable than they appear. There is a genuinely useful, somewhat counterintuitive truth worth sitting with before we move toward practical application. A truth that becomes considerably clearer once you have spent real time studying the 10 tricks discussed throughout today's video. Dishonest, manipulative behavior, despite how chaotic and unpredictable it can feel in the moment you are experiencing it, actually tends to be considerably more predictable and pattern-based than honest, good-faith behavior, precisely because manipulation depends on a fairly limited toolkit of tactics that work reliably against unprepared targets, and dishonest people, having found a particular tactic that works, tend to return to it repeatedly rather than continuously inventing entirely new approaches. Machiavelli observed this dynamic clearly among the political actors he studied most closely, noting that the specific tactics of deception, denial, and manipulation used by rivals across very different individual conflicts tended to fall into a surprisingly narrow set of recognizable patterns that became considerably easier to anticipate and counter once you had genuinely studied them, rather than experiencing each new instance of dishonest behavior as a completely novel, disorienting surprise. This insight matters enormously for how you should approach dealing with a dishonest opponent in your own life. The disorientation and emotional destabilization you likely feel during an active manipulation attempt is not actually evidence that the situation is genuinely unpredictable or impossible to navigate strategically. It is frequently evidence that you have not yet had the opportunity to study this particular person's pattern closely enough to see it clearly for what it actually is: a limited, repeatable set of tactics rather than an infinite, ever-shifting threat. Consider how this insight applies directly to a specific, ongoing conflict you may currently be navigating. The next time this person deploys a familiar tactic against you, denial, deflection, manufactured urgency, or shifting blame, resist the instinct to experience it as a fresh, disorienting surprise each time, and instead, consciously note, "This is the same pattern I have seen from them before," a recognition that considerably reduces the emotional destabilization the tactic depends upon to work effectively, while simultaneously making your own strategic response considerably easier to plan and execute with genuine confidence, precisely because you are no longer navigating unfamiliar territory, but rather a pattern you have already begun to study and understand clearly. The difference between outsmarting and escalating. One final, genuinely important distinction deserves careful attention before we move toward the practical application of everything discussed today: the meaningful difference between outsmarting a dishonest opponent, which is precisely what all 10 tricks in this video are designed to help you accomplish, and escalating a conflict unnecessarily, which frequently produces considerably worse outcomes for everyone involved, including yourself, regardless of how strategically justified that escalation might feel in the heat of a frustrating moment. Machiavelli's own writing contains a genuine, important warning on exactly this point: that leaders who allowed a justified strategic advantage to tip over into unnecessary, excessive retaliation frequently transformed a winnable situation into a considerably more costly, protracted conflict than the original provocation ever actually warranted. Applied to the 10 tricks discussed throughout today's video, this warning asks you to remain genuinely honest with yourself about the actual goal driving your strategic response to a dishonest opponent. Are you documenting a pattern of dishonest behavior because you genuinely need that documentation to protect a legitimate interest, your job, your reputation, a shared financial arrangement? Or are you documenting it primarily to accumulate ammunition for a satisfying, righteous confrontation that will not actually improve your underlying situation in any meaningful, practical way? Are you asking calm, pointed questions because you genuinely need clarity to make a sound decision? Or are you asking them primarily to corner and humiliate the other person? A satisfaction that frequently feels good in the moment, but rarely produces a genuinely better long-term outcome than a more measured, strategically restrained approach would have achieved instead. This distinction requires genuine, ongoing honesty with yourself throughout the entire process of applying these 10 tricks. A willingness to notice when your strategic response has begun serving your own desire for a satisfying confrontation, rather than your actual, legitimate, practical interests, and the discipline to pull back toward the more measured, outcome-focused application of these tools that Machiavelli's broader philosophy was ultimately always describing: protection and strategic advantage, never escalation and unnecessary cruelty for its own satisfying but ultimately counterproductive sake. Recognizing which trick fits which situation. A genuinely practical question tends to arise once someone has absorbed all 10 tricks discussed throughout today's video, a question worth addressing directly before we move into the final application section. With 10 distinct tools available, how do you actually decide, in a real, live situation, which specific trick genuinely fits the moment you are actually facing, rather than simply feeling overwhelmed by the full list and defaulting back to your old, more reactive patterns out of sheer uncertainty about where to begin? A few practical guidelines tend to clarify this considerably. When you are still in the early stages of recognizing that someone is behaving dishonestly, before you have gathered much concrete evidence, Trick 1, silently naming the pattern, and Trick 3, tracking demonstrated behavior over time, are typically your most immediately useful tools because they require no external action at all, simply a shift in your own internal awareness and record-keeping. When you are approaching a moment where direct conversation with the dishonest person has become necessary or unavoidable, Trick 6, asking questions that expose contradiction naturally, and Trick 7, refusing their preferred framing, become considerably more relevant, because these tools specifically govern how you conduct yourself within an actual, live conversation. When you notice a manipulator specifically leveraging public settings or manufactured urgency against you, Trick 4, denying them their audience, and Trick 8, deliberately slowing everything down, address those specific tactical situations directly. And when you are stepping back to consider your broader, longer-term strategy for handling an ongoing relationship or conflict with a dishonest person, Trick 5, careful documentation, Trick 9, proactive relationship building, and Trick 10, knowing when to disengage entirely, become your primary tools for thinking clearly about the bigger picture rather than simply the next single interaction in isolation. This rough mapping is not meant to be a rigid, mechanical formula applied identically in every circumstance. Real situations frequently call for combining several of these tricks simultaneously, rather than selecting only one in isolation, but it offers a genuinely useful starting point for organizing your thinking the next time you find yourself facing a dishonest opponent and feeling uncertain about exactly where to begin, applying everything discussed throughout today's video. Why these 10 tricks matter more than most people realize. It is worth pausing, before we move toward our final practical application, to consider why material like this, genuinely practical tools for recognizing and countering dishonest behavior, remains so surprisingly rare in ordinary education and upbringing, despite how consistently useful it proves across nearly every significant relationship and professional environment most people will ever navigate throughout their lives. Most of us receive considerable instruction, throughout childhood and beyond, on how to behave honestly, fairly, and in good faith ourselves. We receive remarkably little corresponding instruction on what to actually do when someone else, having received that exact same moral instruction, chooses to disregard it entirely and behave dishonestly toward us instead. This gap in most people's practical education leaves an enormous number of genuinely well-intentioned, genuinely capable people without any real toolkit for handling dishonest behavior when they eventually, inevitably encounter it, forcing them to improvise reactive, often ineffective responses in the heat of an actual conflict, rather than drawing on a genuinely developed, practiced set of psychological tools prepared well in advance of the moment they are actually needed. This is precisely the gap today's video has been working to close, not by teaching you to become dishonest yourself, but by giving you the specific, practical tools to recognize dishonest behavior clearly, respond to it strategically, and protect your own genuine interests without ever needing to abandon your own integrity in the process. Machiavelli understood 5 centuries ago that this specific kind of practical education, how to actually navigate a world containing genuinely dishonest people, mattered enormously to anyone hoping to survive and thrive in that world, and yet this same education remains just as rare and just as urgently needed today as it clearly was in his own turbulent political era. Our hope, with today's video and every video we continue to build here on The Hidden Mind, is to close that gap a little further for you personally, one practical, genuinely useful tool at a time. How to actually start applying these 10 tricks. Understanding these 10 tricks intellectually is a meaningful first step, but genuinely internalizing them requires deliberate, ongoing practice applied to your own specific relationships and conflicts, not simply a passive agreement with the ideas presented throughout today's video. If you are currently facing a specific dishonest opponent in your own life right now, begin by applying Trick 1 immediately, silently naming exactly which manipulation pattern they tend to rely on most heavily, whether that is deflection, denial, goalpost shifting, or manufactured urgency, because clearly identifying the specific pattern is the essential foundation that makes every other trick discussed today considerably easier to apply effectively. This first step matters more than it might initially appear, because most people, in the middle of an active manipulation attempt, are too emotionally activated to think clearly about which specific pattern is actually unfolding in front of them, and simply building the habit of pausing to name the pattern, even silently and internally, considerably improves your ability to respond with genuine strategic clarity rather than pure, unprocessed emotional reaction. Once you have clearly identified their preferred pattern, begin quietly, patiently documenting specific instances of that pattern as they continue to occur, resisting the urge toward immediate confrontation in favor of building a considerably stronger, more difficult-to-dismiss case over time. Practice shifting from direct accusation toward calm, specific questioning in your next difficult conversation with this person, noticing how much more naturally inconsistency tends to surface when someone is simply asked to clearly restate their account, rather than accused directly of dishonesty. Pay close attention to whenever this person attempts to establish a particular frame for your conflict, and practice calmly, repeatedly redirecting the conversation back toward the original, substantive issue, rather than accepting their preferred terrain. Notice whenever genuine urgency or pressure enters your interactions with this person, and practice the specific discipline of deliberately slowing down your response, treating that manufactured urgency itself as meaningful information rather than as a legitimate deadline you must respect. And finally, begin honestly assessing, based on everything you have observed and documented so far, whether this particular conflict genuinely appears winnable through continued strategic engagement, or whether the wiser, more strategic choice may ultimately be complete disengagement, redirecting your genuine energy and goodwill toward relationships and situations more likely to actually reciprocate them in return. This final assessment deserves genuine, unhurried reflection, rather than a snap judgment made in a single frustrated moment, and revisiting it periodically, perhaps every few weeks as your documentation and understanding of the situation continue to develop, tends to produce a considerably more accurate, considerably less emotionally reactive conclusion than trying to settle the question definitively during your very first attempt at honest reflection. None of these practices will feel entirely comfortable at first, particularly if you have spent years defaulting to immediate honesty, immediate trust, and immediate good faith engagement with everyone in your life, regardless of how they have actually behaved toward you. That discomfort is simply the natural, expected friction that comes from deliberately building a new set of psychological skills, not evidence that something has gone wrong in how you are applying them. A final word on staying good while getting sharper. Before we close today's video, it is worth addressing directly a genuine concern that may have arisen while working through material this focused on outsmarting dishonest opponents. The concern that becoming this strategically sharp and psychologically aware might gradually erode your own genuine honesty and good faith over time. This concern deserves real, honest attention rather than dismissal, because the line between strategic self-protection and genuine manipulation can, if approached carelessly, become genuinely blurred. The distinction that matters most throughout everything discussed today is this: every single trick we have walked through operates entirely within the bounds of your own honest behavior, silent internal recognition, patient documentation, calm questioning, deliberate redirection, careful pacing, proactive relationship building, and honest assessment of when to disengage. None of these tricks require you to lie, to deceive, or to manipulate anyone yourself. They simply require you to become considerably harder to lie to, deceive, and manipulate, while remaining entirely honest and good faith in your own conduct throughout the entire process. This distinction is precisely what separates outsmarting a dishonest opponent mentally from becoming a dishonest opponent yourself. And maintaining this distinction clearly, even under the genuine frustration and provocation a dishonest opponent frequently produces, is ultimately the most important skill discussed throughout today's entire video, considerably more important than any single individual trick taken in isolation from this broader, guiding principle. There is also a genuinely important emotional dimension to this work, worth naming honestly before we close. Dealing with a dishonest, manipulative person over an extended period of time is genuinely exhausting, regardless of how skillfully you apply the 10 tricks discussed today, and it is worth extending yourself real compassion for that exhaustion, rather than expecting these tools to make the experience feel effortless or entirely free of genuine emotional cost. Even the most strategically sound response to sustained dishonesty still requires real emotional labor to execute consistently, and acknowledging that cost honestly, rather than pretending strategic composure means the situation no longer genuinely affects you, tends to produce considerably more sustainable long-term resilience than simply pushing through in a state of constant, unacknowledged strain. That brings us to the end of today's deep dive into 10 Machiavellian psychology tricks built specifically for outsmarting an opponent who has already decided to play dirty. 10 tricks is a considerable amount of material to absorb from a single video, and you are not expected to walk away today having mastered every single one of them immediately in your very next difficult interaction. What matters far more than immediate, perfect execution is that you now carry a genuine framework, a way of noticing exactly what is happening the next time someone attempts to manipulate, deceive, or destabilize you, rather than experiencing that attempt as a confusing, disorienting surprise, the way it likely felt before today. Silently name the manipulation tactic the moment you recognize it, rather than reacting to it instinctively. Let a dishonest opponent underestimate you, giving them room to overreach and reveal themselves more clearly. Study their actual, demonstrated pattern over time, rather than resetting your trust with every new sympathetic explanation. Deny manipulators the audience their tactics frequently depend upon by redirecting public performances into private conversations. Document carefully before you ever confront directly, building a case considerably harder to deny. Ask calm, specific questions rather than direct accusations, letting contradictions surface naturally in their own words. Refuse to accept a manipulator's preferred framing of any conflict, redirecting firmly back to the actual, substantive issue. Slow everything down whenever genuine urgency or pressure appears, treating that pressure itself as meaningful information. Build genuine credibility and relationships proactively, long before any conflict with a dishonest opponent ever arises, and develop the wisdom and the courage to walk away completely from conflicts that have proven genuinely unwinnable, redirecting your energy toward people and pursuits that can actually reciprocate your good faith. Carry these 10 tricks with you, not as permission to become dishonest or manipulative yourself, but as the sharp, protective toolkit that finally makes you considerably too aware, too composed, and too strategically sound to be easily exploited by the people in your life who have already decided fair play was optional. You spent years, likely, learning how to be honest, fair, and good faith in your own conduct, and it is only right that you now spend some real, deliberate time learning exactly how to protect that same honest, fair, good faith character from the people who would otherwise happily continue exploiting it without ever facing any real, meaningful consequence for doing so. Before you go, I want to ask you once more for a few small things that genuinely matter to this channel. If today's video gave you real, practical tools for a situation you are currently facing, please take a moment to hit the like button. It costs you nothing and directly helps this video reach more people who genuinely need it. Leave a comment below and tell us honestly which of these 10 tricks feels most immediately useful in your own current life. We genuinely read every single comment, and they genuinely shape the direction of future videos here on The Hidden Mind. If someone in your life is currently being outmaneuvered by a dishonest coworker, a manipulative family member, or a bad faith business partner, please share this video with them today. It might be exactly the toolkit they have been needing to finally protect themselves, and it may be considerably easier for them to hear this from a video than from you directly, given how difficult these situations often are to discuss openly, even with the people who care about us most. And if you have not yet subscribed to The Hidden Mind, now is the perfect moment. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly deep dives into power, psychology, and the hidden mechanics of human influence that shape so much of ordinary daily life without most people ever noticing them clearly. Finally, if this video delivered genuine value to you and you would like to directly support the growth of this channel, please consider leaving a super thanks using the button below. Every single contribution genuinely helps us continue building content exactly like this for you, week after week, as this community keeps growing steadily larger and more engaged with exactly this kind of practical, protective material. Until next time, stay honest, stay sharp, and never let someone else's dishonesty talk you out of your own clear judgment. The world contains genuinely dishonest people, and it always will, but that fact was never a reason to abandon your own integrity. It was simply a reason to finally give that integrity the sharp, strategic protection it deserved all along. This has been The Hidden Mind, and we will see you again in the next one.